Hi everyone, this week of FANatics, we will discuss whether the ANC government's plan for our economy will work and reveal solutions that will fix South Africa's economy. So stay tuned because we're going to have a good show ahead. Hi everyone, welcome to Freedom Fanatics. This is a production of the Freedom Education Network, and my name is Sholan. And this week I'm joined by Bheki, who is an analyst at the Center for Risk Analysis. Welcome back to the show, Bheki. How are you doing, sir?
How's it, Sholan? Thanks for having me on. I'm doing well, and yourself, man?
I'm good, Bheki. I can't complain. As always, it's good
Good,
to have
good.
you on the show. So Bheki, we can get straight into our discussion for today.
Right.
Last week, South Africa's new finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, I hope I pronounced his name right, appeared in Parliament and he presented his first medium-term budget policy statement. And this sounds rather intense and fancy, but I think we can first start by breaking down what the medium-term budget policy statement is. So, Becky,
Yeah.
what exactly is the medium-term budget policy statement?
Yeah, so the medium-term budget policy is basically an update from the February budget, looking at the current state of the fiscus, such things such as government revenue, government expenditure. And as much as it is referred to government revenue and government expenditure, all it really comes down to, Sholan, is the people's finances. This is not necessarily the government's funds. This is the tax-paying South African funds, which the government collects through revenue collection and so forth. So what it is essentially portraying the state of the South African people's finances and states where exactly it will be spent on. And it particularly impacts the average South African in terms of allocation of expenditure, in terms of education, healthcare, policing, and so forth.
Okay, yeah, that's a good breakdown for it. And as you say, that it's essentially an update for us on
Yeah.
government expenditure and so forth. What does this speech that we heard last week by the finance minister reveal about the direction of our economy and
Yeah.
things like ISCOM and social grants? Should we be concerned about the state of things, or is there a reason to be hopeful?
We should be very concerned there, Sherlin. Just going through some of the headline numbers, when you're looking at government expenditure, it's still far higher than that of government revenue. Tito Mboweni described it as the crocodile's mouth, where you have expenditure far outreaching government revenue. Now,
Sure.
the difference between expenditure and revenue is the budget deficit, which is projected to be about -8% for this year. That's about 3 times bigger than the economic growth level of the country. The consequence of that we have is that we accumulate large amounts of debt as to the deficit would need to be financed by means of borrowing. Current debt levels are projected up to be about 69% as a proportion of GDP. That has been revised lower due to the rebasing of GDP by Stats SA. But if you look at the trend line, Sherlin, the trend line is going up, which is a major point of concern for ordinary South Africans. As when you accumulate large amounts of debt, it has the same effect as it would have on a household. Banks would see you as a high risk and will charge you a higher interest rate. And that's the same thing with government. Government is being charged a higher percentage of return for this huge amounts of debt, which leads to debt servicing costs to be extremely high. Debt servicing costs, they're currently sitting at about 270 billion. And in about 2 years, they're projected to reach 350 billion. That's massive, surely. In fact, that's close to what we spend on education at 360 billion. And the consequence of that, surely, is that it takes away funds from more important things, such as that of healthcare, such as that of policing, as we're already seeing that we have an incapable police police department here in South Africa, as well as that of law and order. So it is truly concerning. And what I saw from last week's statement is that the finance minister is unwilling to address the core issues of the country. If you look at GDP forecast, for example, is that GDP forecast is projected to be about 5.1% this year. That's largely due to the low base of last year. But for the next 3 years, it's projected to be about 1.7%. That's extremely low when you compare GDP for growth rates of emerging markets at 5%. So they're telling you right there that, Sholan, that they're unwilling to address the core issues that affect the average South African that would lead to increasing living standards in the country. They're unwilling to implement the reforms that would see the privatization of, for example, the electricity grid, the selling off of SOEs, as well as increasing employment levels in the country.
Sure. And that's quite important to note there that they are completely aware of, what it would take for these circumstances to improve. And
Yeah,
my issue kind of is that, when we saw in 2019, if I remember correctly, when the Ramaphosa administration, basically came into power, and we were made to believe that, the reforms are coming. The new dawn is arriving. But
yeah,
do you really think that they have the ability or political capital, whatever you like to call it, to make reforms that actually will improve our economy? Because we know that it is possible, as we saw during the Mbeki era and Mandela era. Do they
yeah.
have the ability to make the necessary reforms?
No, they don't. They do not have the political will to implement the necessary reforms. And they also lack in their way of thinking to implement those reforms. As you mentioned earlier on, in terms of social grants, the finance minister mentioned there's about 27.8 million people that are on social grants. The other side of that coin is that there are about 15 million South Africans that are employed. And that's down by 1.7 from 2019, largely due to the lockdown. That destroyed about 10 years worth of employment in the country. And that's because in those 10 years, we've followed hostile policies that has been detrimental to the South African economy and that have led to stagnating employment levels in the country. So there's no new dawn there, Sholan. In fact, one of the policies that Cyril has been following have been actually been detrimental to the South African economy. When you're looking at expropriation of property without compensation, when you're looking at a labor market regulation that has inhibited young people from upskilling themselves in the employment sector, when you're looking at the education standard where about 5% of matriculants only pass mathematics with a 50% mark and higher, which is far lower than the reported matric pass mark rate of about 75%. So he has absolutely nothing to show. And not only that, but his administration does not have the political will to implement reforms that would see South Africa actually grow at substantial growth levels.
Yeah, and something I also need to note during the speech that he actually gave, there was like this big hype about like his reference to saying that state-owned enterprises like Eskom, Denel, Prasa, SAA will be experiencing some tough love, as he specifically stated in his speech, and it generated some applause in Parliament. But my question is, will it really come into reality? Even though he says that we will no longer bail out these guys dependent on certain circumstances because they are not, up to performance. They aren't performing. But I'm like, you guys have had multiple years like to actually, implement this tough love, but you guys have
Yeah,
not been doing it. And Bheki, in one of our fan articles, which was actually written by Herman Pretorius, it is titled Four Realistic Ideas That Will Make SA Better Immediately. He highlights in this article, that South Africa as a country, we are experiencing high levels of unemployment. We have power cuts, aka rolling blackouts. Just yesterday, I saw on Newsroom Africa where the government is actually giving a briefing on water supply interruptions. So we will actually be starting to experience water shedding, and we experience crime, and all these things literally cripple our economy. It makes a hostile environment for people to invest, start a business, and to actually employ people. And Bheki, my question to you is, if you were appointed as finance minister today, which in my opinion should take place ASAP, because I think you would do a much better job than Enoch. But yeah, what would be the first three actions you would take as the finance minister to turn around South Africa's economic circumstances?
Yeah, so you touched on the fact that the finance minister stated that SOEs will receive tough love. That love is not tough enough because they will still receive money to essentially service their debt. So they're still going to receive money. It's just that they're not. He claims that they will not receive new money. Now that will stand to be the case in the February budget as to whether will he cave towards his cabinet ministers that will try to pressure him to bail out SOEs like Eskom. So if I was the finance minister, I would simply state that we cannot afford to keep continually bailing out these SOEs and that they should be privatized. Indeed, they should. I'd also mention the fact that we have high youth unemployment levels sitting at about 75%, and that labor deregulations needs to be looked at. We need to completely scrap labor laws such as the minimum wage, which acts as a barrier towards younger individuals in the country. Another thing I would have a look at, which is actually very important as well, is electricity generation. You know, a lot of these cabinet ministers agree that there's a decline in the generation capacity in the country, but they're simply unwilling to involve the private sector unless they're faced with extreme pressure. So what I would do is simply state that we cannot go on with the way in which Eskom is being currently run, with cadre deployment, with BEE, with corruption, which is a symptom of the flawed way of thinking of the ANC. So what I would say is that SOEs should be privatized and that the grid should be privatized as well. Another thing I would completely say this with utmost emphasis if I was the finance minister, is the threats of expropriation of property in the country. Not only in the country, and as well as that would negatively impact the average South African as well as businesses, but as well as the fiscus. It also negatively impacts the fiscus when you see a decline in investment levels, when you would see businesses that would stop to invest and expand their operations due to this threat that their property could be expropriated. Therefore, they do not hire more people. That negatively impacts the fiscus when you look at tax revenue collection. When you don't have a lot of more people employed, you cannot collect more tax revenue. So it directly impacts them in a negative light. So those are the policies I would particularly touch on there.
Yeah, nah, brilliant, Bheki. And Ramaphosa, Enoch, if you guys are listening, the solutions are here. Give my man Bheki a call ASAP, please. Because our country does need fixing, and the solutions for it do exist. And as you say, all it will take was political will to fix our economic circumstances.
Yeah.
And guys, Bheki, thank you for your insight. And we've reached the end of this episode. It was as enlightening as always, Vicky. Thanks for making the time. And to our viewers, don't forget to catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and IGTV. And if you want to join Fan and support our fight for freedom, you can sign up at freedomadvocacy.net. And remember, guys, that your freedom is worth fighting for.